Ladies, gentlemen, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, it's lovely to welcome you here for this Behind the Headlines discussion. The Nassau Street gate is blocked, and everybody's walking around, so we are actually expecting a few more people. And with that in mind, it would be lovely if people sitting at the edges, I don't know if anybody is, just move in, and that way if people come in late, they're not scrambling over you. So if you wouldn't mind just moving a few seats and leaving as many seats at the edge, I would really appreciate it. Just because of the closure of the Nassau Street gate. Thank you very, very much. So the first thing is just simply welcome everybody who's in the lecture theatre with us this evening, but also those of you who are joining us online. We are, I think, live streaming. Yes, thumbs up for live streaming, fantastic. Just to introduce myself, my name is Jane Ohlmeyer. I'm the director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is our research institute in the arts and humanities, this beautiful building behind me. In the Trinity Long Room Hub, we do three things. The first thing we do is we celebrate the excellence of the arts and humanities at Trinity. The second thing we do is interdisciplinarity. So we believe that by mixing the disciplines, the magic happens. So I'm a historian, and obviously we've got a couple of historians here this evening, but we also have somebody from the world of linguistics and business. So this is just an example of how by bringing disciplines together, we're going to get some very different perspectives. The third thing we do in the Trinity Long Room Hub is promote public humanities, and this is a great example of it. Many of you will be familiar with our events, and obviously we feel that it's hugely important to have that public discussion and dialogue. This is our second Behind the Headlines, which is one of our signature events of the current academic year, and I think it's very timely and very important to continually ask the question of what is going on in Hong Kong. I think all of us are looking on and actually not entirely understanding what is happening. And so tonight we're delighted to have a very, very distinguished panel with us who hopefully will be able to explain that question. Because despite the extradition bill being rescinded, we know that the protests show no sign of abating, although obviously it's very wonderful that there has been relative peace in Hong Kong for the last, 17 days, you said, Corey, and counting. Anyway, this Behind the Headlines series has been formulated to provide some background analysis and understanding, and particularly to offer some of the long-term insights that the arts and humanities can bring, and to do so in a very informed but also very respectful way. And we're really happy tonight that actually having the perspective of industry, I'll introduce Porrick in a moment. So again, hopefully we'll all have a much better understanding of the current crisis. So our speakers tonight, and I'd like to introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. Our first speaker is Peter Hamilton, who's an assistant professor of modern Chinese history in the Department of History here in Trinity. He focuses on transnational Chinese networks of trade and migration, with particular attention to the Sino-US relations, the intersections between business and education, and the history of Hong Kong. Our second speaker this evening is Porrick Gallagher, Trinity graduate, an engineer, who lived in Hong Kong for 10 years during the 1990s, and then more recently from 2007 to 9. He's the former Managing Director Global Banking and Markets with HSBC in Hong Kong. And tonight, Porrick will focus on the business community in Hong Kong and also the international reaction of the corporate world to the crisis. I should also just say on a very personal note, I've had the pleasure of working with Porrick during the time I was the Vice President for Global Relations here. This is probably going back 2011, 12, 13, where he was a fabulous ambassador for Trinity. As it turned out, it was Sri Lanka. So it's lovely that you're with us this evening, Porrick. Our third speaker tonight is Dr. George Kwok, who is a research fellow based in the School of Linguistic, Speech and Communication Sciences here at Trinity. He focuses on the area of language and identity and contributes to the Chinese studies program that we run. Our final speaker is Dr. Isabella Jackson. She's the Assistant Professor in Chinese Studies in our School of Histories and Humanities. Her research looks at the modern history of China and the global and regional networks that shaped the treaty ports, which were opened to foreign traders in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Isabella is also the holder of a very, very prestigious Irish Research Council Laureate Award. So she's, Isabella, thank you for, I was going to say you're on research leave, so it's lovely that you're here with us. I don't know if you've been following the press. Isabella was in yesterday's Irish Times. George's article has, I think, appeared earlier this evening on the journal.ie, and Peter is going to have something coming out at the weekend. So there's clearly a lot of interest in this topic. And as always, you will have your say. So a couple of housekeeping just things. We will open up the floor to Q&A. As usual, I'll be inviting you to introduce yourself, but to please keep your questions quick and direct. We're not inviting further. We want to try and get as many questions in as possible. And the other thing is we are being live streamed, so just to bear that in mind. But it also means that the podcast will be on our website in the next day or two. So if anybody wants to revisit the conversation this evening or to recommend it to others, you'll be able to do so. Those of you who are into social media, we'd love you to join us on Twitter by tagging @TLRHub and using the hashtag HubMatters. I'm a novice to Twitter, so that's what I'm doing. I'm tweeting. I'm not answering my emails. It just takes me forever to actually to tweet. So, but again, I think it's great when we get that discussion going on social media. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to join me in welcoming our first speaker this evening, Peter Hamilton. Peter.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. So again, I'm a historian, so that will be part of my mission here, is to provide historical context. I think you all probably know that this crisis began in June in response to Carrie Lam, the chief executive's proposed extradition bill. Due to the terms of the 1997 handover, Hong Kong maintains separate legal and criminal justice systems from mainland China. But this bill would have made it possible for residents to be sent to the mainland for trial and punishment. Although this bill has been pulled in September, this bill was really just a spark that ignited a long simmering anger among particular segments of Hong Kong society. And this anger reflects 4 decades of generational and cultural change, as well as leadership failures, I would argue, by 3 governments: the Hong Kong government, the British government, and the Chinese government in Beijing. Put very bluntly or simply, none of these governments has ever asked Hong Kong people what they wanted, or allowed them to assert genuine democratic control over their future. And so with limited time today, I'm going to go through 3 key points about what we call the handover process, or the negotiations and treaties of the 1980s and 1990s that led Hong Kong to be transferred from a British Crown colony to a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China on July 1st, 1997. And these 3 points are: 1, the long delay in deciding Hong Kong's future. It was surprisingly late that this was decided, how this would happen. The actual terms of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and what you probably have heard of as one country, 2 systems. And finally, the impact of the Tiananmen Square massacre. As much as these protests are about the extradition bill, police brutality, and other issues, At base, I would argue, it's really about the handover process, an unfinished business from the handover process. The first major point is that Hong Kong's future was a subject deliberately avoided by all sides throughout the Cold War, in particular the life of Mao Zedong. To step back, to review, Hong Kong had been taken by the British Empire in 3 different pieces over the 19th century. First taking Hong Kong Island in 1841, then the Kowloon Peninsula in 1860, and finally forcing China to sign a 99-year lease on the new territories, the wider outer portion of Hong Kong, in 1898. And that's what set up, that lease is what set up the 1997 deadline. After a wartime Japanese occupation, British rule was restored in 1945 with very active US assistance. But as decolonization accelerated around the world and the communists won China's civil war in 1949, Hong Kong became a very unusual and ambiguous interstitial space at the intersection of multiple empires. Its future was a wide open question, but at no time was independence ever seriously considered by any group. While the new People's Republic rejected the imperialism by which British Hong Kong had been created, Hong Kong was not a particularly pressing issue for Mao's government. Mao, in particular, repeatedly expressed disinterest in this subject. Simultaneously, in the years surrounding 1949, Hong Kong received roughly 1 million refugees fleeing the new People's Republic, creating a humanitarian crisis and opportunities for both Washington and Taipei, the US and Taiwanese governments, to extend aid and use Hong Kong as a propaganda weapon in the Cold War battle for hearts and minds. And this outside influence in Hong Kong did anger Beijing and alerted it to unwelcome possibilities in Hong Kong, as well as making colonial officials nervous. Over the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Hong Kong's economy took off as a manufacturing powerhouse, and a local Hong Kong culture and identity grew up among this city of former refugees. This local identity was still very proudly Chinese, but cherished many different traditions and values from the communist mainland, from the Cantonese dialect to the free exercise of religion and very freewheeling entrepreneurialism. But what would happen in 1997 remained a subject that was studiously avoided by the Hong Kong government, by London, and by Beijing. And the evidence suggests that most Hong Kong people really didn't think about it that much either at the time. Most Hong Kong people were far more concerned with making an economic livelihood, and if opportunity arose, migrating overseas. And this remained the situation until Mao Zedong's death in 1976. But then, as Deng Xiaoping rose to power and China began to change economic directions, something Hong Kong people watched very closely, increasing economic engagement shifted the political climate, and the colonial government, under then the governor Sir Macleos, began to broach the subject of Hong Kong's future. In particular, in 1980 and 81, this topic really gained momentum as local companies expressed concern about investing in Hong Kong real estate if they didn't know what was going to happen in 1997. So formal negotiations only began in 1982. So already just 15 years left before the deadline. There's no plan, per se. The initial proposal of Margaret Thatcher's government was to return legal sovereignty over Hong Kong in exchange for continued British administration for, say, another 20 or 40 years, to delay, in essence. This proposal, for reasons that are debated, angered Deng Xiaoping, and he made clear at that time, in 1982, that the People's Republic intended to regain full administration over all of Hong Kong in 1997. So that's the key context that structures my second point about the Sino-British Joint Declaration and one country, two systems. When China's official position that it would regain administration over Hong Kong came to light in 1982, the Hong Kong public became very concerned. The stock and real estate markets in particular began to plummet, and it spoke to a profound unease in the public about a possible communist takeover. Beijing had no desire to damage Hong Kong, though, both for reasons of face and because Deng Xiaoping rightly understood that Hong Kong could be a very valuable asset for China's economic reforms. And so it's around 1982 that this idea of one country, two systems really begins to gain traction. Many people now claim credit for inventing this idea, and you should be skeptical of all of their claims. With catchy slogans such as Ma Jia Pao, Wu Jia Tiao, or the horses will continue to run and the dancing will continue, Deng Xiaoping very actively and publicly reassured Hong Kong people that nothing really would change in their life after 1997. Simultaneously, though, as negotiations began between London and Beijing, it was Deng Xiaoping who personally rejected any formal participation by Hong Kong people in those negotiations, under the argument that Beijing already represented the local Chinese population. These negotiations led to the signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration in December 1984, which promised that Hong Kong would return to China as a, quote, special administrative region on July 1st, 1997, and that this SAR, as we say, would, quote, enjoy a high degree of autonomy, except in foreign and defense affairs, and thus, quote, Hong Kong's previous capitalist system and lifestyle shall remain unchanged for 50 years, from 1997. And that's the promise of one country, two systems, thus meaning that Hong Kong would retain, and this is enumerated in the document, full civil rights, a separate currency, separate customs arrangements, and even a separate Olympic team. The Joint Declaration was not subjected to a local referendum, though. There was no vote on this. But it was generally well received by the Hong Kong public, and the local stock and property markets began to recover as the 13-year countdown began from 1984. And so then this brings me to my final point, kind of the impact of Tiananmen Square, and that the tentative trust that was building between 1984 and June 1989 was heavily damaged by the Tiananmen Square massacre. Over a quarter of Hong Kong people marched in solidarity with the students in Beijing for the massacre, and another 1 million turned out afterward. To many Hong Kong people, watching the massacre on live television was a very searing personal moment and a warning about their own potential future. Many took steps to ensure that that would not happen to them. Between 1989 and 1997, about 600,000 Hong Kong people migrated overseas to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, particularly through investment for citizenship schemes. In turn, Tiananmen reshaped the final drafts of Hong Kong's basic law, the mini-constitution for Hong Kong, and the agenda of its final governor, its final colonial governor, Chris Patten. Patten unilaterally and provocatively accelerated democratic reforms in Hong Kong, which in Beijing's view was a clear violation of the Joint Declaration, and thus Beijing loathes Patten today. Regarding the basic law, pro-democratic forces successfully rephrased what is Article 45 to enshrine that the ultimate aim of the Hong Kong government legally is obligated to strive for, quote, universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. And so Tiananmen changed the tone and the tenor of what the handover meant for a lot of people. And even though the handover went well in 1997, I would argue, and the point I would leave you with, is that the changes made in the early 1990s are kind of part of the unresolved formula here, what's undergirding the surface, particularly the promise of universal suffrage, which has still not been implemented, but is in the Constitution as something the Hong Kong government must continue to work for. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Omar, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come and address an august audience in Trinity this evening. As a banker in Hong Kong for many years, I'm here at guest spot to talk about business and the commercial reality of the last few months and its effect on Hong Kong. First of all, starting, I suppose, with the Hang Seng Index, the first sort of data point, if you will. Checking earlier, the Hang Seng closed today at 26,000, a little shy of 26,400. This day last year, the market closed at 25,700. So actually, despite everything else, the market has gone up 3% in the last year. We had a major high in the market in April of this year, And with the effect of the first couple of weeks, the first couple of weekends of the crisis in June, a major hit, the market fell 5 or 6%. But actually, as the crisis deepened and it got even tougher on the streets, the market rebounded, and we've seen it come back to, as I say, where it is now, which is just 3% up on where it was last year. The Hong Kong dollar, which, as we all know, is pegged to the US dollar within a very tight range, has had no problem at all during this phase, by and large. Now, you know, in the 20 years since the handover, in the year after the handover itself, we had the Asian financial crisis. GDP fell 5%. The dollar came under huge attack, and the peg was very likely to break during that phase, but it didn't, thankfully, happen. But that hasn't been an issue this time. In fact, during the SARS outbreak in 2003, the dollar came under more effect than it has in the last few months. Now, clearly, we're not out of the woods yet. I'm not saying this thing is finished, but it is remarkable that here we are 4 or 5 months into the crisis, and if you were looking at Hong Kong from the moon and you were just looking at data points, you wouldn't notice anything at all. Interestingly also, last week, Alibaba had its secondary share listing in Hong Kong, called by the Chinese authorities the Great Return to the Motherland. This was the biggest listing, the biggest capital raising on the planet this year, surpassing Uber in June by 3 billion. So a total raising of 11.7 billion US dollars, a large, very successful issuance. Again, showing the robustness of the Hong Kong market. Hong Kong this year has raised more capital than any other market in the world, including New York and London, for the second year running. So again, sailing through. However, we have seen GDP fall by a couple of percent in the third quarter. Definitively, it's going to be worse than that in the fourth quarter, so we will have Hong Kong in recession. So as we're going on our sort of New Year breaks, the word around the world will be, oh my God, Hong Kong has entered recession. That is definitively going to happen. And that will be the first time since the Asian crisis when it's entered recession in '98. So that will make a very poor reading for China, but that is undoubtedly going to happen. Now, as I say, 4 times before in 20 years we've had sort of a relative downturn in Hong Kong, but the market has bounced back. Hong Kong has bounced back very strongly in subsequent years. The year after the Asian financial crisis, we were up at 6% growth levels, so huge levels of growth in those days. So there's a feeling on the street in certain areas, and certainly among the international community, that Hong Kong will bounce out of this. I took a lot of soundings in the last week or so from expat colleagues, from local colleagues, from people in the legal profession, from people in retail, from people in the services industry in Hong Kong, looking at different industries, the effects on them. Looking certainly at the finance industry, and this can be widened out to most sectors. Certainly people have dusted off their contingency plans. So most companies, be they financial or service, have a backup site primarily in the new territories, the area which overlooks southern China, or a little bit further afield up north in Shenzhen. That has either been tested now or actually used. Maybe 5 or 6 Mondays ago, when things got really rough after a very big Sunday, those sites were typically used by large corporates. But looking further into the future, what are the financial services companies actually saying? We have seen reports that 3 billion in FDI has moved from Hong Kong to Singapore alone in the last 4 months. I personally think that's Singapore spin. I can't reconcile that figure with anything I can see that X firm has moved such an amount, etc., giving an aggregate figure of 3 billion. I just can't see that. I think that's a good piece of Singapore spin and a good comms firm from Singapore at work there. Nevertheless, definitively, banks, fintech companies, hedge funds are all looking at what could be moved if things got really bad. But the nub of the issue, frankly, is finance companies specifically, are not in Hong Kong for Hong Kong domestic business. They're in Hong Kong for China business. So nobody is frankly going to leave Hong Kong and fundamentally set up their China business desk out of Singapore or perhaps more harshly out of Tokyo anytime soon, because fundamentally your pipeline would disappear in a matter of months. So whilst people are worried, this is all about China's pipeline. If you take the view, which I certainly do from a commercial and business perspective, that we are only 20, 25 years into the Chinese century, and that China business can only go one way, and probably heavily one way, well then all firms are going to stay rooted to Hong Kong until, and let's hope it doesn't happen, we had something like a Tiananmen Square-esque event in Hong Kong. God forbid. I don't think that is on the cards at all. I think the world is a very, very different place since 1989. Beijing is a very different regime since 89. So I don't see the possibility at all of a harsh, firm hand approach to Hong Kong anytime soon. So firms will look to their backup plans, will look to making sure they know what, let's say, desks within a banking frame they could move to Singapore or a Tokyo, but they aren't going to exercise that button, or press that button, until there would be a huge negative event. People may ask, well, why don't firms, frankly, move to Shenzhen or Shanghai, the two big domestic Chinese financial markets? Shanghai and Shenzhen are massive markets in their own right. The reality is the Hong Kong rule of law, the legal system in Hong Kong, which is based obviously on good old British law that we know well in Ireland, and the lack of capital controls in Hong Kong, meaning no firms of scale are really going to move to a Shenzhen or a Shanghai anytime soon. If you look at what goes on in Shanghai with capital controls, and if you had to exercise a lien or exercise a mortgage in Shanghai or Shenzhen, well, good luck to you. We don't really want to be put in that position. So we like to exercise a mortgage or a lien under British law, basically under Hong Kong law, which is fundamentally the same thing. And we'll use a good American or English firm based in Hong Kong with which to do that. So it's really as simple as that. Firms will not move unless they absolutely have to. Personal view, we will see pragmatism over the next number of months on both sides. There will have to be a little bit of give from China, and we will see a resolution, or a pragmatic resolution to these issues in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's my honor to speak in here. When we are talking about what is going on in Hong Kong, I suppose many people would really want to know is how is the protest going to end, and what is Hong Kong going from there. To understand that, I think we should look at China's approach to Hong Kong in the past few years to get the things into context. So, I don't think the extradition bill alone, just as Peter said, I don't think the extradition bill alone would stir up such a huge amount of people to take to the streets to say no to the government. I think in the past few years, China's approach to Hong Kong really made many Hong Kong people very angry. And perhaps you still remember the umbrella movement in 2014. In 2014, the Chinese government decided that there will be no genuine democracy in Hong Kong. So whoever run for the chief executive, they had to be pre-screened by a nominating committee dominated by pro-Beijing members. So that, of course, from the perspective of the Chinese government, this is what universal suffrage means. But for Hong Kong people, it is not what they were expecting in the past 2 decades. And then another example is in 2016, when 6 pro-democracy lawmakers who were elected by the people, but because the government said that they were not sincerely taking the oath, so they were disqualified. Then Beijing also stepped in to interpret the basic law, the mini constitution of Hong Kong, so that it gives people the idea that the one country, two system is not respected. Then, of course, now this year the government proposed the extradition bill, and that's what brought Hong Kong to the situation now. And then, so the movement, let's call it movement. So the movement has been going on for nearly 6 months now. And then what's next? It depends on how people look at, how China and Hong Kong look at the one country, two system formula. Do Hong Kong people still trust Beijing to uphold one country, two system? Do Hong Kong people still think that Beijing would respect rule of law, Hong Kong's independent judiciary? And on the other hand, it also depends on whether Beijing thinks that Hong Kong is useful. So there are 2 levels to it in terms of useful. First, whether Hong Kong is useful to become a model so that Taiwan would be willing to become part of China. It seems like it is failing. There is a very popular saying in both Taiwan and Hong Kong: today Hong Kong, tomorrow Taiwan. So Taiwanese people don't have any trust in one country, two systems anymore. So the first function that Hong Kong serves is gone. The second function, it serves as China's financial hub. If the Chinese government thinks that Hong Kong no longer serves that purpose, then China may speed up its process to assimilate Hong Kong. So Hong Kong will become just an ordinary city in China. So is Hong Kong still contributing China? The answer is yes. Just last year alone, Chinese companies raised 64.2 billion globally through IPO, initial public offerings. So 64.2 billion US dollars. Among these 64.2 billion, 35 billion was from Hong Kong. So Hong Kong was very important for China to raise capital globally. And Hong Kong is also very important for the internationalization of RMB, the Chinese currency. So, but it doesn't mean China wouldn't do anything. Over the past 10 years or so, the Chinese government is always trying to speed up the process that made Shanghai and Shenzhen to become another financial hub. It is not sure whether the Chinese government want them to replace Shanghai, but it is obvious that the Chinese government want an alternative to Hong Kong. So if they succeed in replacing Hong Kong, or at least sharing some of the Hong Kong's responsibilities now, then the Chinese government will also speed up the assimilation process. But in the short term, I'm optimistic in the short term, because the pro-government parties in last week's election, they had a landslide defeat in the district council's election. and that will affect the election next year heavily. Next year's election is about the legislature. So if the government loses control of its legislature, it will be a disaster for Beijing. So that the Chinese government, in my opinion, they would do something, and the local government will also do something that is not detestable to Beijing, to try to cool down the current situation, so that they will not lose the election next year and another election about the chief executive of Hong Kong in 2022. But once the pro-government camp and the pro-Beijing camp got back on their feet, I don't see why Beijing would go easy on Hong Kong, because as a general approach, Beijing is now tightening its control over Xinjiang. It is tightening its control over the mainland. And I don't see any reason why they would go easy on Hong Kong. So the assimilation process will continue. Maybe there are some hiccups from the perspective of the Chinese government, but it will go on. And but I think a lot of Hong Kong people can see it coming, and that's why so many of them see it as an end game. And that also explains why people are protesting even after Carrie Lam have withdrawn the extradition bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good evening. The protests pose a serious dilemma for the Beijing government. They're the greatest threat to communist rule since the massacre of 1989, the protest that led to that. The government needs to discredit this protest in Hong Kong, internationally, and perhaps most importantly in mainland China. Claiming that the protesters are separatists in hock to foreign powers is an effective way to do this. Since communist ideology has declined as a unifying force in China, nationalism has increasingly taken its place as a means to unify Chinese society. Patriotic Chinese are particularly sensitive to suggestions of foreign intervention on Chinese soil for sound historical reasons, as I will explain. This evening I'll show why Beijing blames the protests on outside interference, why this is such an emotive and potent argument in China, and why that matters. The protests turned the corner from purely peaceful demonstrations to include violent anti-government actions on the 1st of July, the anniversary of the handover from British rule, when young protesters broke into the Hong Kong legislature and draped the colonial-era flag over the podium of the debating chamber. The flag combines the British Union Jack with the dragon and lion motif and instantly evokes the former colony's status as one of the last vestiges of the British Empire. It may seem ironic that a movement calling for democracy and greater freedom should use a symbol of the imperialist past, but it shows the protesters' anger with Beijing and hope for foreign support. For a minority, who are often too young to remember British rule themselves, there is even a form of nostalgia for what they perceive to have been a period of comparative freedom, clean government, and rule of law. Protesters have also flown the Stars and Stripes, initially hoping for American support, and recently in large numbers welcoming Washington's new legislation requiring an annual assessment to confirm that Hong Kong enjoys sufficient autonomy to benefit from favourable trading terms with the US and threatening sanctions for human rights abuses. Now, only a minority of protesters are waving such flags, and others among them have criticised them for it, realising it may not help their cause. Some have even suggested there are Chinese government plans encouraging the use of foreign flags to support the claim that foreign influence is behind the protests and to paint the protesters as unpatriotic. It certainly plays into the government narrative that foreign forces lay behind the protests. For example, China Daily, the primary Chinese state media outlet, described the protesters as being, quote, hoodwinked by foreign forces seeking to create havoc in Hong Kong for political or economic gain. More specifically, the Chinese Foreign Ministry claimed the protests were the creation of the US and spoke of the US Black Hand in the protests. Spokesperson Hua Chunying explained her suspicion was because, quote, many US faces appeared among the protesters, even US national flags. What role does the US play exactly in the protests? The US owes the world an explanation. Beijing accused foreign officials of fanning the flames of Hong Kong after Mike Pompeo, Nancy Pelosi and others met with leading Hong Kong protesters. And a former Hong Kong chief executive claimed that the US and Taiwan were the masterminds behind the protests. However, the Hong Kong police, who are certainly no friends of the protests, they're perhaps hated more than the Hong Kong government by the protesters, stated categorically in August that there is no indication of foreign influence over the protests. China made similar claims about the Tiananmen protests 30 years ago, claiming they were stoked by foreigners. But extensive research since then has shown no significant foreign hand. So why the emphasis on foreign influence? Well, Hong Kong is associated for many Chinese with the Treaty of Nanjing, imposed on China by Britain at the end of the First Opium War, ceding part of Chinese territory to foreign control, as we've heard. Chinese school children, museum visitors, viewers of TV documentaries are taught that this began a century of humiliation for China that included a series of unequal treaties with numerous foreign powers and the devastating Sino-Japanese War, which was the theatre of the Second World War in China. Chinese were treated as second-class citizens in their own country, and the opium trade imposed on China by Britain and Japanese military atrocities are just the most egregious examples of the damage done to China by imperialism. The Communist Party claims it brought the humiliation to an end when it came to power, although in fact its enemies, the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek, successfully negotiated the end of the unequal treaties during the Second World War before the Communists came to power. So the Communist Party takes credit for restoring national dignity to China, and any foreign intervention is an affront to that national pride. The Chinese language edition of the Global Times directly referenced this colonial past, mocking British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt's assertion that Britain would help ensure the joint declaration was adhered to. They stated that nobody, quote, believes the UK will send its only aircraft carrier to China's coast. This is not the 19th century when the Opium War broke out. After the British government called for Beijing to respect the one country, two systems principle, the Chinese ambassador's criticism was widely covered in China. The most widely circulated newspaper's headline, "British politician indulges in bygone colonial fantasy," reflected Beijing's view. British comments on Hong Kong should be dismissed due to their imperialist past. American, German, and other foreign government statements on the protests are also dismissed as foreign intervention in domestic affairs. And the US, Germany, and the other nations targeted are among those who enjoyed imperialist privileges in China in the past. Chinese readers are reminded of the century of national humiliation to help discredit foreign criticism and to discredit the protests themselves. Beijing's anger at even carefully balanced foreign comments calling for both sides to avoid violence is palpable. The Foreign Ministry addressed Washington directly saying, quote, "Hong Kong affairs are entirely China's internal affairs, and you are neither qualified nor entitled to wantonly comment on them. Mind your own business and stay out of Hong Kong affairs." The government may sincerely believe that foreign interference lies behind the protests, indicating, I think, an insecurity and perhaps a fear of a revolution like those that swept through former Soviet republics and the Arab world. It may also be inconceivable to them that Hong Kong Chinese could oppose Chinese rule. So foreign interference helps explain the apparently inexplicable protests. Beijing has the mainland audience in mind, and they hope that nationalistic distrust of foreign interference based on historical grounds will lead mainland Chinese to dismiss the Hong Kong protests as being the result of foreign interference. But I'd suggest that with up to 2 million protesters, a movement on this scale is not due to a few rabble-rousers under foreign influence. As it happens, foreigners in Hong Kong, as we were hearing from Porrig, are less likely to support the protests than Hong Kong Chinese due to the disruption caused to business. The result of the recent local elections, with huge gains for pro-democracy parties, show that Beijing's efforts to cast the protests as foreign-backed and against Hong Kong's interest have not convinced the majority of voters. But it is worth bearing this history in mind to show how understandable it is for China to resist and to resent any suggestion of foreign interference. That's why China's historical experience of imperialism matters. Unfortunately, it also makes it unlikely that international condemnation of police brutality against the protests will achieve much at all. Thank you. Thank you to our 4 speakers. I mean, that was just fabulous. And again, really rich, diverse perspectives there. So we have time now for probably up to half an hour of questions. We'll wrap it up at 5 to 8, unless nobody has any questions, and I can't believe that that's going to be the case. What we usually do is try to take 3 or 4 questions at a time. We'll come back to our panel. Again, ladies and gentlemen, please introduce yourselves and keep your questions clear and brief, just to allow us to get in as many as possible. So there are mics, and we have to use the mics in here. The acoustics aren't great. Can you give me a sense of who'd like to ask some questions? So we've got one here at the front, one in the middle. Maybe we'll try and get the mic into the middle, and then this gentleman at the front will be the next question. Sir, please go ahead.
My name is Kevin Fox, and I just have a question which I hope you won't regard as naive. It has been my understanding that the current difficulties commenced when China sought the extradition of an individual from Hong Kong, and students then reacted badly to that, which in turn led to the introduction of the extradition by Carrie Lam, which has subsequently been withdrawn. And that all we're really looking at here is a group of youngsters and others who have taken matters to the point of no return, but now will have to return, as it were.
Thank you for your question. I think our speakers did address that head on, but they can come back to that. Please, sir.
Hi, I'm Jason. Thank you for the time. I just have a question as to what will the impact of the signing of the Hong Kong Human Rights Act do to the financial sector in Hong Kong, especially where it can potentially scrape away all the favorable terms and special benefits given to Hong Kong.
Thank you very much again. We'll come back to that. We have a third question. Anyone else? There's just one up this person, just at the back here.
Hi, my name is Charlotte Paul. I want to ask about what do you think about the future of the independence of universities in Hong Kong? As we've seen that universities have been the site of battlegrounds between protesters and police. Thank you very much.
Great question. So there's 3 to kick things off. Maybe we'll start with a specific one from Jason to yourself, Porrick, because I think the other 2 we can range across the panel. But in terms of the impact of HR legislation on the financial sector.
Great question. And certainly, I think life after this will be more difficult for financial firms, but it's just something they're going to have to deal with. The reality still remains. This is the conduit for all capital markets business out of China. It's the conduit for 95% of FDI back into China. And that's the real issue. So a lot of things would have to change for that fundamental to change.
Again, just pass, if you wouldn't mind passing the mic there to Peter. Would you like to address Kevin's question and then the one at the end about the universities? I don't know if you've got anything to say.
First,
Yeah.
The initial case actually about that structured a lot of the extradition bill issue is actually related to a history in the sense that you couldn't make this up, perhaps odd details of a murder that happened in Taiwan, where a young Hong Kong couple, about 20-year-old or so, couple went to Taiwan, and the boyfriend murdered the girlfriend in Taiwan and then returned to Hong Kong. Hong Kong also does not have an extradition bill with Taiwan. And so that case and the issue about justice in this murder case related to Taiwan was actually the the example cited as to why this situation needed to be rectified and to create an extradition relationship with various places that Hong Kong did not have extradition relationships with. Regarding the universities, I think that's a really interesting, difficult question to answer. I think that academic freedom and the idea of a knowledge-based economy is very important to both the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government in Beijing, and that to the extent that it is academic freedom relates to the economy, to science, to technology, all of that, I think they would be very hesitant to change the universities too much. But the role that the universities have played is likely to draw their attention for sure.
Can we pass up to Isabella and to George and let them get in on the conversation? If you'd like to speak, address either of those questions, any of those, if you've anything to say, please feel free, George, and then pass it on to Isabella when you're done.
Okay. I would say that I would like to address to that gentleman's question first. I think the youngsters, they are very desperate, and actually before the 9th of June, when the 1 million people took to the street to say no to the extradition bill, nobody thought that there would be so many people. And Hong Kong people were in despair, actually. They saw that this is a matter of life and death for many people. So that is why I know many people's perception is a group of young people rioting, but actually they are being backed by a lot of adults, well-educated people, and sometimes even the business sector as well, because even the business sector would say no to the extradition bill. And because this is a matter about the difference between Hong Kong and China, whether Hong Kong will continue to be Hong Kong. So, thank you.
Pass to Isabella.
Thank you. And just to thanks. Just to respond to that first question and build on what George was just saying, it wasn't the matter of whether or not a criminal should be extradited to Taiwan that got people on the streets. It was the fact that this extradition law would have meant that criminals could be extradited to mainland China, but that could include political criminals, and it could include people who had not committed a crime under the law of Hong Kong, and would thus mean the end of the rule of law. And it's the rule of law which one of the things that underpins Hong Kong is a good place to do business, but also what makes it different from mainland China. So that's why what seems like a reasonable thing, sure, what murderers should be chased wherever they committed their murder, became such a touchstone for much wider issues. And also it isn't just a matter of it being young people, it's led by young people. I don't think they should be dismissed just because they're young. I teach at university, I think young people are fantastic. But we heard, a million people went to the streets. After that, almost 2 million people took the streets in a territory that only has 7 million population in total. So this is extraordinary levels of support for the protests. Now, most of those people wouldn't necessarily support where the protests have become violent, but they do broadly support the aims of the protesters. And then 2 weeks ago, in the local elections, the overwhelming support for pro-democracy candidates shows also that although Beijing was suggesting, hoping that a silent majority opposed the protests, that's clearly not the case. It was an overwhelming statement of support for the protests and their aims. And the deliverance of the joint declaration, which included the ultimate goal for universal suffrage. Beijing has constantly backtracked from when, if ever, that might meaningfully be implemented. So there is support for that in Hong Kong. Hong Kong Chinese want to see meaningful democratization in their lifetimes. They do not want to see the opposite of that, which seems to be the direction of travel. So I really don't think the protests are naive and should be dismissed as such.
Do you want to comment on the universities?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've got friends at the University of Hong Kong, and it is an issue. Pressure being put on universities taking them away from principles that I hope we'd all endorse of academic freedom. I mean, it's not unique to Hong Kong, it's happening in lots of places, but it certainly is an issue there. Yeah.
And just to expand before we take another round of questions, it's Turkey, it's Hungary, it's India. You know, some of the stuff that's going on in the UK and this dismissal of experts. You know, I think it's something we should all, here we are in a university, we should be extremely concerned about is that commitment to freedom of speech, and also the fact that universities are not political instruments. So, you know, a very good question. Other comments? So there's somebody at the back, actually there's two at the back. One on either side, and then this gentleman in the blue. So, firstly yourself, and then the other one at the back, and then this gentleman in the blue here. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I am Luca. I'm from Hong Kong. That I have been seeing what's happening in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has been a police state for months. That the police have the major power to control the protests, and it seems the Hong Kong government lose control over the police. So my question here is that the major voices from Hong Kong society to demand the independent investigation, to establish an independent investigation committee that will meet the expectation from the majority of Hong Kong society. That committee is not only to investigate the police, but any party involved in the protest will be get into the investigation that will meet the majority of the Hong Kong society. So my question here is, what will be the possible explanation to that the Hong Kong government refuse to establish such demand from the protester and from the majority of Hong Kong society?
Thank you, Luca. Thank you. At the back, did you have a question?
Yes.
Please.
Hi, I'm Martin from Bangkok, Thailand.
Okay.
Was there around July as well to like observe the protest? And actually, you really agree that like I think like the image that the media portray that like a lot of people wear masks is actually not necessarily true to all protesters. A lot of people go there without masks.
Just if you could ask a question.
Sure. So my question is that like we see a lot of like democracy like rhetoric here, right? But like I think like I just want to know like how much like nationalism actually like play roles here as well, right? How Hong Kong people actually look towards mainland people, or how it's actually different from when Hong Kong people actually looking for people from like, for example, like Pakistan or like South Asia or like also people who work inside Hong Kong. So like why the sentiments actually like a lot of different things.
Thank you very much. And then this gentleman here in the blue.
Hi. It was mentioned a couple of times that they
Your
don't
name?
have... I'm sorry, Neil.
Neil, thanks.
Thanks for the talks. It was mentioned a couple of times that they don't have universal suffrage there, but we did see, I mean, obviously that the pro-democracy candidates did very well in these big elections. Could you just give a clear estimation, explanation of, you know, what universal suffrage would actually look like there? What are the impediments to it at the moment that need to be removed? I just didn't get a clear explanation of that.
That's a good question. Let's start with that one maybe and then move on to the other two. Isabella, you've got the mic.
Okay. Yeah.
Would you mind just starting and we'll just pass it along and let everybody join in?
I mean, we should acknowledge that what Beijing points out repeatedly is true, that there was no universal suffrage under British rule. And as mentioned, Chris Patten started to accelerate the direction towards democratisation for fear of what China might do after the crackdown in 1989. So no, there's never been a case where Hong Kong people could elect their government. What they can do is vote in local elections, and that's what has recently taken place. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't catch that. But what they were promised in the joint declaration was that they would, at some point in the future, be able to elect directly, one person, one vote, their government, their leaders. And one of the things that's controversial, which I think George touched upon, was that Beijing said that a couple of years ago they were going to screen candidates that people could elect. So this was a way of them sort of meeting the requirements of the joint declaration, but it not being meaningful democratisation, because it wouldn't be that anyone who wanted to stand and was qualified to stand could do so. They would be pre-screened by Beijing. So that's one of the reasons why we don't see universal suffrage in Hong Kong. I wonder if either of you would like to add.
Somebody want to add? Yeah.
The current situation for electing what's alleged a legislative council and the chief executive is that the legislative council is basically half directly elected, and then the other roughly half of seats are what are called the functional constituencies, which is basically the guilds and professional organizations have certain numbers of seats, and they choose within their own profession. So the lawyers have like 2 seats, and the hotel business has like 1 seat. And so kind of it's half direct election and half functional constituencies. The chief executive is chosen by a nominating committee of, I think it's 11 or 1,200 people, who come from various different backgrounds, but it's stacked, where the executive and billionaire class of people, to be very Bernie Sanders about it, who are generally quite pro-Beijing, have the majority. And thus, that in the current kind of 1,100 people who get to vote for the chief executive, it's quite heavily towards people who will comply with a certain set of candidates and, you know, who's palatable.
In an Irish context, we used to call it gerrymandering. But anyway, I don't know if either George or Napori. What about the question, I thought was interesting one about the Hong Kong nationalism and the treatment of non-Hong Kong residents. I don't know if anybody's got anything to say there. George, if you have something to say into the mic, great. It's on.
I'm not sure if I understand the question right. There is a survey conducted by the University of Hong Kong, and from 2008 on, young people's national identity has been going down. But before 2008, a lot of people shared the pride of Beijing hosting the Olympic Games. So I think that would be quite strange to me, because after 2008 would be the time when Beijing tightened the grip on Hong Kong, and when it tried to stir up more nationalism in Hong Kong, and it is doing disservice to Hong Kong. And I would like to talk about the investigative committee. The Commission of Inquiry. Of course, a lot of people blame Carrie Lam for not establishing a committee because of her personality. But I don't know her personally, of course. But I would say, because from day one, Beijing's tone is there are external influences, external forces. And the investigative committee would look at both sides. What if the committee's result show that there is no foreign influences, and then you need to answer Beijing, what are you going to do if the result is there is no foreign influences there?
On the committee, I would also just add, which you may well already be familiar with, that publicly the chief executive has said that the reason that they would not create such a commission is that the police force already has an established channel through which complaints of abuse, improper use of force, etc., are handled, and that this would be an extra-legal, illegal way of doing so that is not in accordance with the law or with the rights of police officers, that this is an extrajudicial thing. So that would be, I think, if she would hear what she would say to that.
Great, we have time for one more round. Any other questions? So there's a gentleman here in yellow. So and then, yeah, we'll just, so start here and then we'll move over. There we are. So ask your question and then just pass the mic along, please.
Cool. Would you attribute China's relatively recent growth and growth as a world player and success to them adopting some kind of Hong Kong characteristics, like maybe more capitalism, more free markets?
What was your name?
Adam.
Adam, thanks very much, Adam. Can you both pass it along to Claire? And then there's a gentleman here in the white shirt. Please, Claire, go ahead.
Claire Muddy. My question is about the role of Britain as a co-signatory to the Joint Declaration. To what extent could or should the United Kingdom intervene more vocally to guarantee the one country, two systems principle?
I'm just going to, oh, you can take that one, we'll retrieve that one.
All right.
Juggling the mics here.
Hi, this is Stefan. So in 2047, 50 years after the handover, the status of the two systems will perish, and Hong Kong will move into China, into operating China. So the elements of democracy will stop. So actually, from a perspective of Hong Kong, it doesn't actually matter the fight for democracy in the long term, when the system anyway will perish at some point. So they anyway have no choice, and they want to
Stefan,
keep
a question.
living, we must see. Yeah, that was the question. Doesn't matter. Does the fight for democracy matter if the system perishes in 2047?
Okay, thank you very much. 3 questions there. I don't know. So why don't you, and then we can.
I mean, certainly Hong Kong has been incredibly helpful to the business moving to a capitalist structure in China, especially to the southern China area, the area around Shenzhen and Guangdong. It's heavily connected now, great rail system into southern China. In some areas of Shenzhen, you could actually be in Hong Kong. It's that good. It's also very useful, to remember that Hong Kong has been this great capitalist force for thick and 50 years now. So it was useful always for China to look to Hong Kong just down the road and see how successful it was. And so, as I say, definitively the people in southern China, in Guangdong, were greatly enamored by Hong Kong's success. I mean, that has been a great help to move minds in Beijing in a capitalist way over the last 20 years especially.
I'll take the 2047 question. Similarly to the previous unknown situation of 1997, it is not at all known or discussed what happens in 2047. So it is not automatic that in 2047, the SAR ceases to exist and it becomes another Chinese city. That is another event horizon that has been created that I think, just like with the 99-year lease, seemed like forever.
Yeah.
With the creation of 50 years before 1997, people thought, who knows what China will be like at that point, and what the world will be like, and so it's unknown. And so it is fully possible that the system of one country, two systems could be extended if that were agreeable to various parties.
Before you pass the mic on, what about Britain as co-signatory? Do you want to comment on that? It's a tricky question.
It's a tricky question I was hoping to pass on.
Oh, okay.
But I think that you have to separate out power versus morality. I think morally, of course, there is a certain obligation that is incumbent upon the British government as a co-signatory there. I think in reality, everybody understands that there is no further role for Britain to play, whether it wished to or not, and that there was no further role for Britain to play as of July 2nd, 1997. But that would be my take.
Of course, there are signatories to the Good Friday Agreement, and it's very interesting to see where that's taking us. Isabella?
Yeah, I mean, on that point about the British intervention, I mean, they're obliged by treaty. So more than morally, I'd say they're legally obliged to try and do everything they can to ensure the joint declaration is adhered to. They're obviously afraid, just as much the world is afraid of China now because it's so important for trade, and Brexit's making Britain more vulnerable to needing to plead. Sorry, another evening where Brexit's But you know, they are in a weaker position, and so they're even less able to press points with China than they would have been without that. And even if they did, for the reasons I outlined, it would not be helpful for Britain to try, or any other foreign country, to try and say, look, hold back on the police brutality, or these are actually quite legitimate aims that the protesters are voicing, or really you should be adhering to that joint declaration, because it just supports the narrative that it's foreign intervention. So it actually doesn't help the protesters, even though the protesters are looking abroad for support very explicitly. Their best bet is to shore up support at home rather than to support that narrative that they're beholden to foreigners, whether they're British or American or German or anyone else.
George, do you want to come in on any of this?
I just want to add one sentence to Isabella's remark. The Chinese government repeated time and time again that the joint declaration has completed its historical mission. The Chinese government doesn't think that it is valid, and it doesn't think that the British government has anything to do with Hong Kong.
Any final questions? So at the back, and sir, I think you've just asked one, haven't you?
No.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. So this gentleman here in blue, sorry, and then at the back, and then we'll probably run out of time. We'll see. And then there was somebody at the back as well. Please, go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much for a very fascinating presentations, four of them on this very interesting subject. To come back to the last question, British, actually I would say, what about the Americans? The Americans Congress only passed legislation the last 2 weeks. What I'm concerned about, and it was touched on lightly, but surely the panel thinks that the Chinese have a limit on their patience, and being reminded of things like the Opium War, and which I've seen a monument in Beijing reminding people in English about the burning of the Winter Palace. I don't know what the Chinese version said, but coming back to my question.
Just about to say the question, please.
Yes, well,
just trying to fit in as many as possible.
We must be getting near the end of the patience in Beijing.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. We'll take one at the back, this gentleman at the back. Others, and I'll try and take a third one, but please ask your question quickly, and that way it allows us to get back to the panel. Is there one on this side? Yeah, okay. Peter, just here, if you could pass the mic. Please, sir, go ahead.
My name is Jerry, and I just have one question. You said universities should not be a political instrument for a government.
That's me.
but why is Trinity allowing Chinese government to endorse one of its biggest society, the Chinese society, to work as CSSA, which is actually a surveillance agent to monitor Chinese students and prevent Chinese students and Hong Kong students from being politically deviant from the Chinese political correctness. And as a Chinese student, I don't feel safe to say what I want to say anymore. Once Trinity, there's a CSSA in Trinity. So
thank you.
What does Trinity come
That's a great question. Thank you. And then we'll have one final question here. Please go ahead.
Could I just ask you to say a little bit about day-to-day life for the ordinary Hong Kong person, and has that deteriorated over the years?
Thank you. What's your name?
Sean.
Thank you. Very good. We've got three final sets of questions here. I don't know who'd like to start. Isabella?
I'm interested to speak. Yes, I'll take, if I may, the Trinity question about the CSSA. I agree with you. I think it's something that if we raised it with the provost, he would take very seriously. And I'd encourage anyone who feels, as you do, to write directly to the provost, who is the person in charge of the university. And I would support what you're saying.
Thank you. Daily life in, do you want to comment on that? And both actually you and Porrick might comment on daily life, if you wouldn't mind. And then we'll come back to the limits of patience. I think it's a good question too, please.
I think I can give you one example how people are experiencing the current situation in Hong Kong now. A friend of mine who is working in a Chinese bank is owned by the Chinese government, a state-owned enterprise. And someday in September, he and his colleagues were called into a room. Their manager told them, be careful with what you said online. If you were found to post something anti-government on Facebook, serious consequences. And on some day in August, when the protesters are organizing a general strike in Hong Kong, then my friend's manager went down to the floor to check who was absent there. Then I think this is the first aspect for like a chilling effect, and for ordinary people who are not care about politics, like some of the people, they were just ordinary people in different politics, but sometimes the policemen were just they just trespass into private premises, and then they made ordinary people very angry as well. And then they shot more than 10,000 tear gas canisters now. And then I can see there will be a big dispute afterwards, because many people are complaining about the potential harm that the tear gas can bring to their health and their children as well. So even if now the current protests end, then there will be a lot of discontent that will be going on.
Thank you.
There was just two brief additions to that. From an expat perspective, very little change at all in Hong Kong. Life goes on as normal, a little bit more care to be taken on routings on a Sunday, let's say, but apart from that, no much change. That was the view certainly of a Chinese firm in Hong Kong, the people associated with that. If we look at what happened during the summer with Cathay Pacific, the flag-carrying airline, you have this horrible dance that a corporate has to make between its people, its staff, wanting to go out in the streets, the firm itself beholden very heavily to its regulator and minority shareholder Air China. So that resulted in the CEO having to fall on his sword because he said nothing. He didn't come down either as a yellow ribbon man or a blue ribbon man, if you want to use the parlance of the day, and hence the firm had a problem. The big four accounting firms, very similarly, their staff on the streets every weekend, but the mandates coming from China, Beijing calling the senior partner on a Monday to say, we don't want you making these comments and your mandates will dry up. So a very difficult dance for international corporates.
Do you want to come back to the Chinese limits of Chinese patients question?
Sure. Generally, I'm of the belief or the opinion that the Beijing government is very patient and thinks in timelines that are longer than most US and European style democracies who are primarily concerned with the next election cycle, or even shorter than that, the headlines tomorrow. And that most, particularly senior Chinese leaders, are engineers and scientists by training who prefer working with numbers and graphs and long-term trajectories of things. And so I'm sure that there is frustration and that there is issues of patience, but I think in that sense the patience issue is not one that we should be super concerned about. Generally, I think they think that they have all the time in the world to wait this out. That's generally the preferred strategy.
We're going to wrap things up, and I'm going to invite each of our panelists just to say, there's one thing they want to take from the discussion this evening to help us actually better understand what's going on. What would that one thing be? So I'd start with you. Just, I think it's really important. If there's one key message, Peter, what would it be?
I think that my key message would just be that don't underestimate the larger historical and structural forces at work here, that we generally don't predict the future, but if I had to, I would say that my guess would be that this will go on for some time as a prolonged set of structural, historical, legal issues that are very difficult to resolve, and that are, I'm hoping for pragmatism, but I would bet on prolongedness.
Thank you.
I think, yeah, mine is very much a hope that, we've seen 16 or 17 days now of relative calm. Sunday, a little bit of a hiatus in Kowloon. But hopefully that time has been used by both sides to realise that unless there is pragmatism shown here, Hong Kong could just be another city on the southern seaboard of China with just a very decent port and a very decent airport, and not a huge amount else.
Thank you.
I just think that if China doesn't change its approach to Hong Kong, something similar will happen again in the not so distant future. Just like after the umbrella movement in 2014, after 5 years, we have these protests now. So I think it is time for maybe for the local government at least, or I think sometimes it is because the Chinese government is so visible in these few years. Previously, they can just give all the blame to the local government, and then they become invisible. They just said, carry out, problem solved. Hong Kong people would thank the central government. But this approach doesn't seem to be working now.
Thank you. And last but not least, Isabella.
Yeah, I think there's signs of Chinese strength and weakness in the response to the protests, a little bit like what George was just saying. Strength, they have absolute surveillance. They can, in many ways, dictate the kind of the narrative about these protests, and yet the protests continue every week, and they are powerless to stop them. And I think the narrative that I was talking about of foreign intervention suggests a real insecurity on the part of Beijing, that they fear the consequences of giving or enshrining the kind of freedoms that people in Hong Kong want. So I find that interesting, but that combination of strength and weakness is potentially a little explosive, so it's quite concerning for those of us watching.
Yeah. Okay. It's been an amazing discussion. I have a couple of announcements, and then we'll thank our panel. Just in terms of the Christmas season has already begun, so we won't actually have another signature event now till the 27th of January, and it's a session on All That Remained, the Four Courts Blaze of 1922, which will be one of these behind the headline panel discussions. It's part of our Out of the Ashes lecture series. So please check the website for that. There's a whole raft of amazing things happening in the new year. The Hub celebrates its 10th birthday, so it's going to be a celebratory birthday year for us. In the meantime, if you want some relief from the excesses of the festive season, do visit our website. Lots of podcasts, lots of great stuff to listen to. And I'd like obviously, thank you. A couple of thanks. Firstly, the John Pollard Foundation that makes this Behind the Headlines series possible. I want to thank my own team who work so hard to make these events run so smoothly. I want to thank you for coming out tonight and actually for asking such great questions. That was a fabulous discussion. And then I want us all to thank our fantastic panellists for just such a really fascinating discussion. So let's thank them again.